A storm gathers over the vast, unending Eurasian plains. The sky, once a brilliant blue, now churns with angry shades of gray and black. A tempest brews on the horizon. The wind howls a mournful song across the grasslands, bending the tall blades of grass in waves of submission. In the distance, the low, rhythmic beat of drums begins to sound. A heartbeat of the earth itself, growing steadily louder and more insistent. It carries not music, but menace. This is not just a change in the weather. It is the arrival of a force of nature, a human hurricane from the harsh steppes. A power that will sweep across the known world, leaving a trail of fire and fear. This is where our story begins. In the heart of this untamed wilderness, a new power was stirring. For centuries, the Roman Empire stood as a beacon of civilization, its legions, its walls, a symbol of order and might. The emperors believed their dominion eternal. They had faced barbarians before, but never anything like this. This was different. A force forged in the crucible of the endless steppes, a migratory wave of nomadic warriors, always on the move. No cities to defend, no fields to plow, only their horses, only their bows, only a burning desire for plunder. From this tempest, a leader would emerge, a figure shrouded in shadow and rumor, a name that would become a curse. He came from the east, beyond the Danube, the edge of the Roman world. A master of horse and bow, a brilliant tactician, a leader of unparalleled ruthlessness. He did not seek to build or to govern like the Romans. He sought to conquer, to dominate, to make the world tremble at the thunder of his horsemen. He was the lightning in the heart of the storm, the focal point of destructive power. His name was Attila. They called him the Scourge of God, a name born of terror and devastation, a title that would echo through the centuries. In the sprawling cities of the late Roman Empire, from the opulent halls of Constantinople to the bustling, yet increasingly anxious streets of Rome itself, his name was whispered with a unique kind of dread. This was an empire showing its age, a civilization groaning under the weight of its own history. It was divided, beset by internal strife, and its borders were porous, constantly tested by migrating peoples the Romans dismissively called barbarians. Into this world of fading glory and rising fear, the name Attila fell like a death sentence. The stories that preceded him were of burning cities, fields strewn with the dead, and endless columns of refugees fleeing his advance. But to understand the man, one must first understand the people who made him. Before Attila, there were the Huns. For centuries, they were not a unified nation, but a scattered confederation of nomadic tribes. A whirlwind of clans swept across the vast, unforgiving steppes of Central Asia, their origins shrouded in mystery. They were a people forged in the saddle. Their entire existence revolved around the horse. Roman observers noted with a mix of awe and disgust that the Huns seemed almost fused to their mounts. They were born on horseback, conducted their business from the saddle, and some said they even slept on horseback. This unparalleled equestrian skill was the foundation of their military might. Their primary weapon was the composite reflex bow, a marvel of engineering. Smaller than European longbows, it could be wielded with deadly accuracy from a moving horse. They fought on horseback, a swirling, chaotic mass that was in fact a highly disciplined force. They would charge, unleash a storm of arrows, feign retreat to lure their enemies into a trap, and then turn to annihilate them. For the organized, infantry-based legions of Rome, it was a terrifying and alien way of war. In the year 434, the mantle of leadership over the most powerful of these Hunnic tribes passed to two brothers, Attila and his elder, Bleda. They inherited their position from their uncle, King Rugila, who had died while campaigning against the Eastern Roman Empire. Rugila had already united many of the clans, forging a formidable power on the banks of the Danube. and now this vast confederation was in their joint hands. One of their first acts was to renegotiate the terms of peace with Constantinople. They met with Roman envoys not in a grand hall, but in the open field at the city of Margus, remaining on horseback throughout the negotiations. This was a deliberate act of political theater, a clear assertion of Hunnic dominance. The message was unmistakable. The Romans were supplicants, and the Huns were their masters. The Romans, desperate to secure their northern frontier, had little choice but to concede. They agreed to double the annual tribute they paid to the Huns, from 350 pounds of gold to 700. For a time, this river of gold kept the peace. But it was a peace bought, not won. As the brothers' power grew, so too did the tension between them. Bleda the elder was said to be more content with raiding and tribute. But Attila possessed a different kind of ambition, a vision of empire. History is filled with tales of sibling rivalries, but few had such world-altering consequences. While the details are obscure, lost to the unwritten history of the Huns, sometime around the year 445, Bleda disappears from the historical record. The Roman chronicler Priscus, who met Attila in person, states plainly that Attila murdered his brother to seize sole power. Whether through a sudden act of violence or a carefully orchestrated plot, the result was the same. From this point forward, the Huns had one master, one undisputed ruler whose authority was now absolute. His horde was now a diverse army composed not only of Huns, but also of conquered peoples, Goths, Alans, Gepids, and other Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, all bound to his will. Yet even at the height of his power, he cultivated an image of austerity. While his lieutenants feasted from golden goblets plundered from Roman cities, he famously used a simple wooden cup and bowl, a reminder of his nomadic roots and his separation from the decadent world he sought to conquer. He had united the disparate forces of the steppes into a single fist, poised and ready to strike at the heart of civilization itself. The era of tribute was over. The era of conquest was about to begin. The peace bought with Roman gold was never destined to last. It was a temporary reprieve, a fragile dam holding back a torrent. By the early 440s, the Eastern Roman Empire was stretched thin, its attention and its finest legions diverted south. The Vandal king, Gaiseric, had captured Carthage, seizing the breadbasket of the West and threatening Roman naval dominance in the Mediterranean. For Attila, watching from his great encampment on the Hungarian plain, this was a strategic opportunity of unparalleled scale. The Balkan frontier, stripped of its best defenders, lay exposed and vulnerable. He didn't need a reason to attack, but a pretext would make the invasion seem righteous. That pretext arrived in 441 at the border market town of Margus. The local bishop, in a foolish and sacrilegious act, was accused of crossing the Danube to plunder the royal tombs of Hunnic chieftains, desecrating the sacred resting places of Attila's ancestors. Whether the accusation was true or a convenient fabrication, it mattered little. For Attila, it was the spark he needed to ignite a firestorm of retribution. The insult was public, the violation profound. He demanded the bishop be handed over. When the Romans refused, Attila had his casus belli. Hunnic armies moved with a velocity the Romans could not comprehend, a whirlwind of horse and steel swarming across the Danube frontier. This was not a lumbering legionary march, it was a torrent. Each warrior, born to the saddle, could cover 100 miles a day, living off the land and carrying his own supplies. Their primary weapon, the composite bow, was a marvel of engineering, capable of piercing Roman armor at a distance, unleashing a storm of arrows before the enemy could even form a battle line. Viminatium, a major military base and capital of the province of Moesia Superior, was the first major city to fall. The Huns, once thought to be incapable of taking fortified positions, now deployed sophisticated siege techniques learned from their Gothic and Roman subjects. Massive battering rams, shielded by wet hides, pounded the gates. Siege towers, constructed with terrifying speed, rolled towards the walls, allowing Hunnic warriors to pour over the ramparts. The city was utterly destroyed, a lesson in terror for all who would resist. Its population was either slaughtered where they stood or rounded up to be enslaved, their wealth plundered and their homes reduced to rubble. The Danube frontier, once a mighty shield of forts and legions, was now a river of fire, its banks littered with ruins and bones. The wave of destruction rolled south through the Balkans. Margis, Serdica, Singidunum, Nisus. City after city was sacked and burned. The Roman field army, hastily recalled from its Vandal campaign, was crushed in battle. By 442, the thunder of Hunnic hooves could be heard outside the very gates of Constantinople. With his armies defeated and his provinces in flames, Emperor Theodosius II sent his Magister Militum Aspar to sue for peace. The Roman general had to ride deep into the heart of what was now Hunnic territory, into the sprawling, chaotic camp of the man who had brought the empire to its knees. Attila received him not as a diplomat, but as a supplicant. His demands were staggering, designed not just to enrich himself, but to humiliate the emperor. The annual tribute, the 700 pounds of gold that had kept the peace for a few short years, was to be tripled. 2,100 pounds of gold per year. An astronomical sum. And that was not all. To secure the withdrawal of his armies, Attila demanded an immediate one-time payment of 6,000 pounds of gold. It was extortion on an imperial scale. Theodosius and his court had no choice. The alternative was the complete collapse of the Balkan provinces and a potential siege of Constantinople itself. They accepted. The emperor, ruler of half the civilized world, agreed to every humiliating demand. Raising the gold caused a severe economic crisis. The imperial treasury was emptied. To meet Attila's price, the state resorted to desperate measures. Wealthy senatorial families were forced to sell their ancestral jewels and melt down their silver plate. The poor, already struggling, were taxed into oblivion to pay tribute to a barbarian king. The wrath of the Huns proved more powerful than Rome's pride. Attila withdrew, his warriors laden with treasure, leaving a smoldering wasteland behind them. But the humiliation was far from over. In Constantinople, the court seethed with impotent rage. They were trapped, forced to send wagon loads of gold north to a man they despised, all while enduring the constant arrogance of his envoys, who strutted through the imperial palace as if they were the masters. Unable to beat Attila in battle, the emperor's chief minister, the eunuch Chrysaphius, plotted a more subtle revenge: assassination. He secretly approached Attila's ambassador, a Hunnic chieftain named Adeco, and bribed him with a bag of gold to kill his king upon his return to the Hunnic camp. The gamble failed spectacularly. Adeco, perhaps out of loyalty or perhaps seeing a greater opportunity, revealed the entire plot to Attila before it could be carried out. The king of the Huns now had proof of the emperor's treachery. When the next Roman embassy arrived, expecting to finalize the assassination, Attila did not execute them. That would have been too simple. Instead, he unleashed a campaign of psychological terror, treating them with icy contempt and making them wait for days, fully aware that their murderous plot had been exposed. Then, he sent them back with his own envoy, Orestes, bearing a simple, terrifying message for Theodosius. It was not a request for more gold, but an indictment delivered with the force of a death sentence. He came from the steppes to make emperors tremble, and now he would make one grovel like a slave. Attila declared that just as he himself was descended from a noble line, Theodosius was now a disgraced slave who had fallen from his own noble heritage. The emperor, Attila declared, was no better than a treacherous servant who had tried to murder his rightful master. The fear did not always arrive with the thunder of hooves. It often began much more quietly, as a whisper carried on the wind. Bustling forums of Rome, crowded marketplaces of Carthage, merchants sharing news, travelers sharing tales, the name on everyone's lips, Attila. Taverns whispered in hushed tones, public baths whispered in hushed tones. For the people living in the path of the invasion, there was no time for rumor, only for flight. The Roman roads, those great arteries of the empire, became choked with a desperate tide of humanity. The scenes were ones of pure chaos and despair. Families were separated in the surging crowds. The old and the sick were left behind on the roadside, unable to keep up. They spoke of the city of Metz, razed to the ground on the eve of Easter, its inhabitants slaughtered in the very churches where they had sought sanctuary. With his power absolute and his armies unified, Attila's gaze shifted. But to the west, the other half of the Roman world was crumbling. The pretext for war arrived in the form of a message from a woman named Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Attila, a master of political opportunism, chose to interpret this desperate plea as a proposal of marriage. He immediately accepted, and, as her dowry, demanded half of the Western Roman Empire. The winter of 450 was spent in furious preparation. This was to be a war of conquest, an invasion aimed at the heart of Roman power in the west, the wealthy and strategic province of Gaul. In the spring of 451, the storm finally broke. A colossal army crossed the Rhine River and poured into Gaul. The names of the cities that stood in their path would soon become synonymous with massacre and destruction: Metz, Reims, Tongeren. Having left the Balkans a smoldering ruin, Attila's gaze fell upon the fractured provinces of Gaul. In the spring of 451, his vast host crossed the Rhine, a tide of destruction that washed over cities like Metz, Reims, and Paris. His ultimate objective was the strategic city of Aurelianum, modern-day Orléans. Controlling its bridge over the Loire River was the key to striking deep into the Visigothic kingdom of Aquitaine, shattering the last vestiges of Roman power in the region. The city's bishop desperately sent word to the one man who might be able to stop the apocalypse: Flavius Aetius, the supreme commander of the Western Roman army. The hope of Gaul, and perhaps the entire Western Empire, rested on the frantic efforts of Aetius. He was a man who knew the Huns intimately, having spent time among them as a hostage in his youth. He understood their speed, their tactics, and their leaders' boundless ambition. But his own resources were perilously thin. The Roman army was a patchwork of loyalties, its core legion supplemented by various allied barbarian tribes, or foederati. Facing the largest Hunnic invasion in history, Aetius was racing against time to assemble a force capable of even slowing Attila down. To stand a chance, Aetius had to achieve the impossible. He performed a diplomatic miracle, riding to the court of the Visigoths. He had to convince their aging but still formidable king, Theodoric I, to join forces. These were bitter enemies, their peoples having clashed for generations. Theodoric initially hesitated, suspecting a Roman trap or hoping the Huns would simply weaken his Roman rivals. But Aetius argued persuasively that Attila was a threat to all, a storm that would consume Goth and Roman alike. Reluctantly, Theodoric agreed. This fragile, improbable alliance was forged not on trust, but on shared terror. The combined army marched to relieve Aurelianum, arriving just as the city was about to fall. Attila, unwilling to be caught in a siege, withdrew eastward, seeking favorable ground for a decisive battle. He found it on the Catalonian plains, a vast, open expanse near modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne. Here, in late June of 451, two of the largest armies of the ancient world collided in a cataclysm of violence. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was a sprawling, chaotic, and incredibly bloody affair. It was a maelstrom of nations. On one side, Attila's Huns and their subjugated German vassals. On the other, Aetius's Romans, Theodoric's Visigoths, and a contingent of Alans. The fighting raged all day across a front several miles wide. Aetius, a master tactician, seized a critical ridge overlooking the battlefield early on, giving his forces a crucial advantage. Attila responded with a frontal assault, throwing his best warriors at the center of the Allied line, hoping to shatter their coalition. The losses on both sides were staggering. In the swirling chaos of a cavalry charge, the Visigothic king, Theodoric, was thrown from his horse and trampled to death by his own men. But his death, rather than breaking his people's spirit, enraged them. Led by Theodoric's son, Thorismund, the Visigoths launched a ferocious counterattack, driving deep into the Hunnic lines and threatening Attila himself in his wagon laager. As darkness fell, the battlefield was a butcher's yard, with some estimates claiming over 165,000 dead. Attila was cornered, his army mauled. But Aetius, ever the pragmatist, made a calculated decision. He allowed Attila to retreat, fearing that a completely victorious Visigothic army would become a greater threat to Rome than a wounded Hunnic one. Attila had been stopped. His aura of invincibility was shattered. For the first time, the scourge of God had been met with a force he could not break, but he was far from finished. The following year, in 452, he gathered his forces once more.
Learning from his defeat in Gaul, he avoided a direct confrontation with Aetius's field army and struck directly at the heart of the Western Empire, Italy. He descended through the Julian Alps, sacking and utterly destroying the city of Aquileia, its refugees fleeing into the nearby marshes, where they would lay the foundations of a new city, Venice. Attila's advance seemed unstoppable, but his army was suffering. Italy had been hit by famine, and the Huns' supply lines were stretched thin. Disease began to ravage their camps. It was in this moment of vulnerability at the Mincio River that he met an unusual Roman embassy. It was led not by a general, but by the Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo I. The exact details of their conversation are lost to history, but Leo, backed by the moral authority of the Church and likely a large tribute of gold, pleaded for Rome's salvation. Faced with a weakened army and the promise of treasure, Attila made a stunning decision. He turned his army around and withdrew from Italy. In the spring of 453, back in his great camp on the Hungarian plains, Attila was planning his next campaign, a renewed assault on the Eastern Roman Empire. Before setting out, he decided to take another wife, a beautiful young woman named Ildiko. A great feast was held to celebrate the union, filled with excessive drinking and revelry. At the height of the festivities, the great king retired with his new bride to their wedding tent. The next morning, when Attila failed to appear, his concerned guards broke down the door. They found Ildiko weeping hysterically beside the bed. On the bed lay Attila, dead. There were no signs of a wound. He had apparently suffered a severe nosebleed and, lying on his back in a drunken stupor, choked on his own blood. The most feared man in the world had not fallen to a Roman sword or a Gothic spear, but to a mundane, ignominious accident. The grief of the Huns was as violent as their lives. His warriors cut their long hair and slashed their faces with their blades, mourning their chieftain not with tears, but with the blood of men. He was buried in secret, encased in a triple coffin of gold, silver, and iron. The slaves who dug the grave were executed to keep its location hidden forever. Attila was the sole force holding his vast, predatory empire together. With him gone, its cohesion dissolved overnight. His many sons fell to squabbling over the inheritance, and the subjugated tribes, seeing their chance, rose in rebellion. Within a generation, the Hunnic Empire had vanished from the map, its people scattered and absorbed into other groups, leaving almost no archaeological trace. Attila the Hun was a storm. He swept out of the vast, unknown East, a force of nature that ripped through the known world, shaking the foundations of an empire that had stood for nearly a millennium. He was not a state builder, but a state breaker. His legacy is not one of cities built, but of empires humbled, and borders redrawn by the terror he inspired. He forced the mighty emperors of both East and West to pay him tribute like common vassals. He drove migrations that would shape the ethnic and political map of Europe for centuries to come. And on the Catalonian plains, he inadvertently forged a pan-European identity, uniting disparate peoples against a common threat. He shattered the aura of Roman invincibility forever. The storm had passed, but the landscape would never be the same. The world he left behind was one of chaos and flux, accelerating the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire and paving the way for the rise of the medieval kingdoms. The name Attila still echoes through history, a powerful symbol of barbarian fury, the ultimate outsider who brought an aging world to its knees.